The Miller home in Portland, Maine, stood like a quiet relic of the past. Its tall windows caught the soft morning sun, and the red brick walls seemed to guard years of laughter, tears, and family memories. The old wooden staircase groaned softly under each step, as if whispering the stories of everyone who had ever walked its path. Caroline Miller, 38, stood motionless at the kitchen counter for a moment, letting the sound of the hallway floorboards creaking above wash over her. To some, those sounds might have been a nuisance, reminders of an aging house. But to Caroline, they were comforting. Fragments of a home she loved, echoes of a life she had built. "Mommy, look. The clouds are making animals." 6-year-old Sophie's voice rang out from the living room. Her tiny palms pressed against the glass, as though she could reach out and touch the shapes drifting by. Caroline smiled to herself. Sophie's imagination never seemed to run dry. Every day brought a new story, a new dream. She poured a glass of orange juice and called her daughter to the table. Breakfast in the Miller household looked perfectly normal, yet something felt slightly off in the air. Daniel Miller, Caroline's husband, appeared at the bottom of the stairs in his crisp shirt and tie, looking every bit the polished professional. At 40, he was handsome, well-mannered, and careful to present the perfect image to neighbors and colleagues. His charm was undeniable, but sometimes at home, his cheerful smile stopped short of his eyes. "I've got a big meeting this weekend," Daniel said, tousling Sophie's hair with an easy grin. "If it goes well, it could change everything for us. Daddy will bring you back a surprise. Promise." Sophie's face lit up at once, and she nodded eagerly. Caroline said nothing. There was something about the tone of his voice that unsettled her. Daniel had been acting differently in recent months, ever since her mother had passed away and left Caroline with a sizable inheritance. The grief was still fresh, still cutting, but Daniel's restlessness felt like something else entirely, something she could not name. And then there was Evelyn Miller, Caroline's mother-in-law, who had a habit of phoning at the most inconvenient moments, always reminding Caroline she would be stopping by soon. Evelyn was poised, graceful, the picture of social refinement, but Caroline knew she had never truly approved of her. Evelyn's affection for Sophie came with strings attached, expecting the child to be quiet, polite, and almost unnaturally well-behaved. That morning carried an invisible weight. Caroline tried to keep her focus on Sophie's bright giggles, but unease coiled inside her chest. The Miller family looked perfect to the outside world, but inside, something darker was beginning to stir. In the days that followed, the house fell into a familiar yet strangely tense rhythm. Caroline threw herself into work, preparing for an exhibition at the Portland Art Museum, her most ambitious project yet. The show would feature forgotten women artists of the 20th century, voices lost to time, and Caroline felt a deep sense of duty to bring them back into the light. Work became her anchor, but in the quiet hours, she felt the presence of something she couldn't quite name. Sophie, ever curious, often wandered into her study. One afternoon, the little girl held out an old photograph she had found buried in a box. "Mommy, is this Grandma?" she asked. Caroline took the faded picture and stared at her own childhood face smiling beside her late mother. Her throat tightened. "Yes, sweetheart. That was Grandma when she was young," she said softly. Sophie nodded, then whispered as though she were sharing a secret too important for the walls to hear. "Grandma talks to me sometimes. She says I should be careful." Caroline smiled faintly and brushed it off, telling herself that children often mix dreams with memories, especially a child as imaginative as Sophie. But the word stayed with her, like a shadow creeping along the edges of her thoughts. The sense of unease grew worse when Sophie confided in her again a few nights later. "Mommy," she said quietly, "I saw Daddy talking on the phone with Grandma Evelyn. They were whispering. Daddy said you wouldn't notice." Caroline's hand froze mid-brush as she smoothed her daughter's hair. Daniel was always on the phone for work, often speaking in low tones, but there was something in Sophie's serious little face that struck Caroline like a warning. She smiled gently at her daughter. "Sometimes adults have to keep work secrets, my love. But thank you for telling me." Even as the words left her lips, a shiver of doubt took root in her heart. That night, when Daniel said he was going to bed early, Caroline stayed up to finish some work. As she passed by his study, she noticed the door was slightly open, a rare sight since he usually kept it locked. Inside, papers were stacked neatly on the desk, arranged with a precision that almost felt too deliberate. One drawer refused to shut all the way. Caroline's eyes landed on a folder labeled Life Insurance. Her fingers shook as she opened it and scanned the papers inside. Just a week after her mother's funeral, Daniel had taken out a high-value policy in Caroline's name, with himself as the sole beneficiary. Her chest felt heavy as dread settled deep in her stomach. She placed the folder back exactly as she found it and pushed the drawer shut. She tried to calm her thoughts, convincing herself that Daniel was simply trying to be responsible, securing their future. But the timing so soon after her inheritance, it sent a chill down her spine. The next morning, Sophie stood quietly by the window. "Mommy, I dreamed about the basement," she murmured. Caroline froze mid-step. The old servants' basement, sealed decades ago and mentioned only once in the property report, had never been discussed around Sophie. "What basement?" Caroline asked softly. Sophie's tone was serious, unchildlike. "The one with the secret room. It's for hiding when bad people come." Caroline forced a smile, but her heart pounded painfully against her ribs. Were these just dreams or warnings? By Friday evening, the unease had grown unbearable. Daniel kissed Sophie goodbye, suitcase in hand, insisting his business trip couldn't wait. Caroline smiled, but inside her dread thickened. Once he was gone, she wandered through the house room by room, running her fingers along the furniture, opening and shutting doors, as though making sure the house was still hers to claim. That night, as Sophie sat coloring in the living room, Caroline saw a shadow outside, a man in a dark coat moving slowly along the edge of the property. He paused near the garage before circling toward the backyard. Caroline's breath caught. She yanked the curtains closed and pulled Sophie close. "We're staying inside tonight," she said with forced calm, but her skin prickled with fear. When bedtime came, Sophie begged to sleep in her mother's room. Caroline hesitated, then agreed. The little girl clutched her stuffed rabbit, as if it was her only shield from the world. Before sleep took her, she whispered again, "Daddy and Grandma are planning something bad." Sometime after midnight, Caroline woke to a sharp, chemical odor seeping through the window cracks. Gasoline. Her throat burned. Panic shot through her chest as she rushed downstairs to check the doors. The back door wouldn't budge. Neither would the side or the front door, all locked from the outside. Then came a mechanical hum, and metal shutters clamped over the windows, silencing the night. Smoke began leaking under the kitchen door. At the top of the stairs, Sophie stood, her rabbit clutched to her chest. "Mommy," she whispered, voice trembling, "we have to escape now." Caroline's pulse hammered. "Where can we go?" she asked. Sophie's voice shook but carried certainty. "Behind the pantry. Grandma told me in a dream." The smoke was thickening, the faint crackle of fire now unmistakable. Caroline grabbed Sophie's hand and ran for the pantry. It looked ordinary at first, shelves stacked with jars and cans, until Sophie pushed the lower shelf aside, revealing a wooden panel. Caroline tugged hard until it creaked open, exposing a dark hole. "Go, sweetheart," she urged. Sophie crawled in first, rabbit tucked under her arm, and Caroline followed, pulling the panel shut behind them. The passage was narrow, damp, and smelled of dirt. Cobwebs brushed against their faces as they crawled forward. Smoke seeped faintly into the tunnel, urging them on. "Where does this go?" Caroline whispered. "To the garden shed," Sophie replied steadily. "Grandma showed me." They crawled toward a dim sliver of light ahead, the sound of the fire growing louder behind them, heat licking at their backs. Caroline murmured prayers as she pushed herself forward, terrified but determined. Sophie never looked back, her small body moving with a strange resolve. Finally, they reached a rusted metal door. Caroline shoved it open with all her strength. Fresh, cold air rushed in, filling her burning lungs. She lifted Sophie and stumbled out into the yard. Behind them, the house was already engulfed in flames, the fire roaring skyward. The night glowed a terrible red as sirens wailed in the distance. Sophie tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mommy, let's go to Miss Barbara's," she said, naming the neighbor 2 doors down. Caroline clutched her close, tears streaming down her face. "You saved us," she whispered. Sophie met her mother's gaze with calm, steady eyes. Grandma had been watching all along, and she knew exactly what Daniel had planned. Caroline's heart pounded at the realization, but she didn't waste time arguing. Clutching Sophie against her chest, she sprinted across the yard to Barbara's porch. When the neighbor finally opened the door, the two of them stood there covered in soot, their faces pale and terrified. "Please," Caroline begged breathlessly, "call the police. Daniel set the house on fire. He tried to kill us." Barbara didn't hesitate. As she grabbed the phone and dialed, the fire raged behind them, devouring the Miller house that had once been the center of their lives. By the time the fire department arrived, the home was little more than a roaring furnace. Flames tore through the roof, while the wooden beams groaned and gave way under the heat. Neighbors stood at a distance, murmuring in shock as firefighters fought a losing battle against the inferno. Caroline sat shaking on Barbara's porch, Sophie wrapped in her arms as if she might disappear if Caroline let go. Despite the searing heat of the fire, both of them were trembling. When the officers arrived, Caroline's voice was unsteady but unwavering. "This wasn't an accident," she told them. "My husband planned this. He wanted us gone." Lieutenant Harris, a gray-haired detective with sharp but kind eyes, crouched to meet her gaze. "Ma'am, that's a very serious claim. Do you have anything that can back it up?" With trembling fingers, Caroline pulled out her phone and unlocked it. She showed him the photos she had secretly taken the night before. Snapshots of the life insurance policy hidden in Daniel's desk. It clearly listed him as the sole beneficiary. Harris's jaw tightened as he looked through them. "This is concerning," he said quietly, "but it might not be enough on its own." That was when Sophie tugged on her mother's sleeve. Her small voice was calm but resolute as she spoke. "Daddy said if Mommy was gone, everything would be his. He said it to Grandma Evelyn on the phone. He said it should look like an accident." The officers exchanged glances, their expressions shifting. Harris turned to Sophie gently. "Sweetheart, when did you hear that?" 3 days ago," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was standing outside his study. He was looking at papers and told someone the security system was ready." Later that day, investigators confirmed everything Caroline and Sophie had said. They discovered gasoline had been poured around the property at key points, and the security system had been deliberately tampered with so the house could be locked from the outside. What had seemed like a frantic accusation was rapidly becoming an airtight case of attempted murder. Detectives launched a manhunt for Daniel. His story about a business trip fell apart immediately. Colleagues at the investment firm testified there had been no meeting scheduled. Within 24 hours, police found him at a gas station on the interstate. In the trunk of his car were bundles of cash, fake identification documents, and a burner phone. Daniel was arrested on the spot. During questioning, he shouted, "I'm innocent. This was all my mother's idea. She pushed me to do it." When police brought Evelyn Miller in for questioning, her polished mask didn't last long. At first, she played the part of the shocked and outraged mother, but when confronted with Daniel's accusations and the mountain of evidence, she snapped. "That ungrateful boy," she spat. "I gave up everything for him. I only wanted what was best." Investigators pressed her further, and eventually the whole truth came out. Mother and son had plotted together to get rid of Caroline and Sophie, seize Caroline's inheritance, and make it look like a tragic accident. The financial motive was clear. Daniel was drowning in debt, his image as a successful businessman nothing more than a carefully crafted illusion. He had been burning through money on failed investments and secretly supporting a mistress in another city. Evelyn, blinded by her devotion to her son, convinced herself that removing Caroline would give Daniel the fresh start he deserved. Caroline listened in stunned silence as the detectives laid it all out. Every uneasy look Daniel had given her, every whisper Sophie had overheard, it was all real. It was all true. As the sun rose over the blackened shell of what had once been the Miller family home, Caroline sat in the back of a patrol car, holding Sophie on her lap. Her mind was numb. That house had once been filled with laughter, morning coffee, and Sophie's toys scattered across the living room floor. Now it was gone, destroyed by the man who had vowed to protect them. But there was one thing left, one thing even the fire couldn't take. They were still alive. 3 months later, Caroline found herself sitting on a wooden bench in the Portland courthouse, hands clasped tightly together. Sophie sat beside her, kicking her feet nervously but holding her chin high. The courtroom buzzed with chatter, reporters, neighbors, strangers, all eager to witness the trial. The prosecution methodically presented the evidence. Photos of the disabled security system. Reports showing gasoline had been deliberately spread throughout the house. Phone records tying Daniel and Evelyn together in the weeks before the fire. Piece by piece, the picture became clear. Daniel Miller had tried to kill his wife and daughter for money. This was no crime of passion. It was planned, premeditated, and cold. Daniel's defense attorney attempted to push the blame elsewhere, but the evidence told its own story. Daniel's defense hinged on the claim that his mental state had crumbled under the weight of financial pressure. When this failed to move the jury, he turned his accusations toward his own mother. "She controlled me," he said, his voice cold. "Evelyn Miller has always pulled the strings. This was her plan." The courtroom erupted with murmurs, but Evelyn's reaction silenced everyone. She stood, her hands trembling, voice sharp with fury. "Don't you dare blame me, Daniel. I did everything for you. I only followed through because I believed you deserved better than Caroline." Her words fell like stones, stunning even her own lawyer. But the most unforgettable moment came when little Sophie was called to the stand. The 6-year-old clutched her stuffed rabbit as she walked to the witness chair. The bailiff gently swore her in, and the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Sophie spoke softly but clearly, recounting how she had overheard her father on the phone with her grandmother. She repeated what she had heard. "If Caroline is gone, everything will be mine. We just need to make it look like an accident." The room seemed to freeze as she explained how her father had been looking over old blueprints of the house and how she had discovered the hidden passageway. Because, she said, her late grandmother had told her about it in a dream. When the prosecutor asked which grandmother she meant, Sophie simply pointed toward Caroline. "Mommy's mommy. She warned me." A ripple of disbelief passed through the spectators. Though it was not traditional evidence, there was a power in Sophie's words that no one could deny. By the time she stepped down, Caroline's eyes were wet with tears. Her daughter's bravery had spoken louder than any lawyer could have. In the end, the jury found both Daniel and Evelyn guilty. Daniel was sentenced to 15 years for attempted murder and arson, while Evelyn received 8 years for conspiracy. Justice had been done, though its cost was steep. 6 months later, the Miller estate was a memory. A modest cottage on the outskirts of Portland became home for Caroline and Sophie. It was smaller, quieter, but filled with warmth and safety, things the old house had not given them in a long time. Each evening, golden light glowed from the windows, and the comforting smell of apple pie drifted through the kitchen. Caroline returned to her museum work, slowly regaining her balance, and founded a project to help young female artists. She called it the Second Light Foundation, a name meant to honor the chance to shine again after hardship. Some of her inheritance funded the project, transforming what had once been a painful subject into a source of purpose. When Caroline explained the name, Sophie smiled and said, "It means we get to start over." Sophie, too, was finding her way forward. With the gentle help of Dr. Michael Hayes, a child psychologist, she learned to speak about her fears instead of keeping them buried. She made friends at school and filled sketchbooks with bright drawings. One of them, showing herself, her mother, and her grandmother, was chosen for a school exhibition. Caroline framed it and hung it proudly in their hallway. One evening, as winter approached, Michael joined them for dinner. He had become more than a counselor. He was a steady, reassuring presence in their lives. After dinner, Sophie leaned against her mother's arm and asked, "Mommy, what makes a real family?" Caroline thought before replying, "Family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who stand by you, protect you, and want you to be free." Sophie glanced at Michael and said shyly, "Then maybe he's family too." They all laughed softly, the sound mingling with the quiet crackle of the fireplace. That Christmas Eve, snow fell gently outside as Caroline and Sophie sat by the fire. The old fear had not entirely disappeared, but peace had replaced the constant dread. Sophie held her worn stuffed rabbit close as Caroline kissed the top of her head. "Your bravery saved us, Sophie." You gave us a second chance. The little girl looked up and whispered, "We saved each other, Mommy, and Grandma helped too." Caroline smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. Whether it had been her mother's spirit or simply the power of memory, she felt certain something had guided them when she was too weak to go on. Staring into the flames, Caroline understood that trust should never be blind, and that true family is found in those who choose to stand with you when everything falls apart. It is seen in a child's courage, a friend's steady support, and the quiet hope of a new beginning. To anyone listening, never ignore the small voice that tells you something is wrong. It just might save your life. And when you find those who love you honestly, hold them close. If this story touched you, share it with someone who might need to hear it and leave your thoughts below. Your support keeps these voices alive, reminding us all that even after the darkest night, there can still be light.